Ramaswamy and Musk themselves are billionaires. In fact, they are just two of the many billionaires Donald Trump is surrounding himself with as he assembles his new cabinet and other high-ranking positions. His pick to head the Treasury Department, Scott Bessent. His pick for Secretary of Commerce, Howard Lutnick. Linda McMahon, his pick to lead the Department of Education. His choices for ambassadors to France and the UK, Charles Kushner and Warren Stevens. Steve Witkoff as Special Envoy to the Middle East, and Kelly Loeffler as Small Business Administrator. All of them have one thing in common, at least. They are billionaires with a B. Doge and the billionaire cabinet is where we begin the hour with some of our favorite experts and friends. MSNBC political analyst Tim Miller is here. He's a former RNC spokesman and now a host of the Bulwark podcast. Also joining us, U.S. special correspondent for BBC Studios, MSNBC contributor Katty Kay, and CNBC senior Washington correspondent Eamon Javers, who interviewed Ramaswamy yesterday. Eamon, we start with you. Your thoughts?
Well, look, I mean, they're envisioning a total transformation of the federal government, top to bottom, and everything that it does. They're going to look under every possible couch for change in the federal government. The question is whether they can do it. The first problem they've got is one of authority, right? They're an outside commission. This is basically a souped-up blue ribbon commission, and we've seen those in Washington before try to tackle spending, and we've seen them fail. So the other question is just the scale of what they're trying to do. I mean, they've talked about $2 trillion of cuts out of a $6 trillion budget. I mean, you really just can't do that without cutting, what they call all of discretionary spending. That is like everything that the federal government does, including the Pentagon, and then maybe touching some of Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, things that Trump has said he doesn't want to touch. When I asked Ramaswamy yesterday for examples of some big ticket items, north of $10 billion, north of $1 billion that he'd like to cut, he didn't offer any examples. I asked him yesterday what Trump has given him as guidance for things he'd like to cut. He also didn't offer any examples. So they're at a very preliminary stage here. But they're brimming with optimism, and they're certainly very smart guys.
Tim Miller, what are you watching in this endeavor?
I'm watching you try to pronounce Doge. It's the first thing I'm watching.
Yes, I'm not a, well, it speaks for itself what I am and am not, right?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure what the difference is between a souped-up blue ribbon commission and a blue ribbon commission. It's like the Cybertruck of blue ribbon commissions, I guess. I don't know. I mean, we'll see what these guys can do. I mean, neither of them have really any D.C. experience. The Republicans have an astonishingly narrow House majority. There was a House seat that just flipped to the Democrats a couple of days ago. It's kind of the last one that was outstanding. And so now they've got a 220 to 215. The Republicans do House majority, even narrower than last time the Democrats picked up a seat. And at least 3 of the members will be gone for a while because Trump appointed them to various positions in the government. So it's like, we all watched the Republican House clown show during the Kevin McCarthy saga and all the votes. They couldn't even vote on a leader. I mean, these guys can't vote on, what to name post offices. And so they're all going to agree. You're going to get every single one on board to agree with these draconian cuts. We'll see. I don't know. I mean, to me, I think it's a lot of show. What we might end up with is something pretty similar to what you saw with the wall, where they build a couple miles of it and then call it a victory. Maybe they cut a couple easy things and then call it a win and pretend like Elon Musk used his great power to overhaul the entire federal government. I think that's one possible option. I think that's the most likely. Or the second most likely option is that they do start cutting real services to poor people. Because that's where a lot of the money is going. And those are the big ticket items Eamon is referencing. And I think that there'd be a lot of support for that within the Republican conference, despite the fact that they're claiming to be the working class party now. I think cuts to Medicaid, Head Start you mentioned could be on the chopping block. I think that's the more serious threat than some of the goofy stuff that they're talking about with Doge.
And I do appreciate you calling me out on my pronunciation challenges there. I want to follow up, though, with you, Katty. The idea of cutting government waste, 100% of the public is for that, 100%. Nobody is for government waste, absolutely nobody. in the history of polling around policy and political questions, no one has ever said, yes, keep the waste. But the snag is that even Donald Trump, when asked in interviews with friendly folks, and he almost exclusively does friendly interviews, refuses to say one thing that he would cut. So as smart as these gentlemen may be, what is your sense of what mission they go in trying to cut?
So I looked up kind of obscure government spending programs that have been tried to cut and manage and people haven't managed. And there's things like hamster fights, money for hamster fights at Northwestern University. Money has gone on giving quails cocaine to see what the effects of addiction might be. So, I mean, yes, there are odd programs that are tiny amounts in terms of the proportion of money that is being actually spent by the US government. And as anyone and previous administrations have tried to do this, has tried to cut government spending, will realize it's one thing to say you're going to do it, and it's one thing to get that extraordinary reception, the fawning that we saw up on Capitol Hill. I think that's a fair word to describe it, of Elon Musk walking around with his toddler. I don't know why his toddler was on his shoulders. Perhaps that's all part of the kind of show of this. But when you actually try to cut things, those members of Congress that he was meeting who were so welcoming of him today will suddenly turn around and say, hold on a second, that's a government program that my voters care about. They actually don't want cuts to the number of people who are monitoring air traffic control, or to the number of people at airports who are, trying to check your bags at security because that causes them hassle. Anything that people actually then try to cut, there's a constituency for. And that's why it's so difficult to cut it. And maybe they will break what has been gridlock over this up until now, and they will find ways to cut serious amounts of money. But any time in Washington, the saying is every time you want something not to happen, you create a commission. And this feels increasingly like one of those commission reports that's going to sit on a shelf and gather dust.
Eamon, let me play some of what Vivek says he's going to cut. This is from a podcast interview in September.
Yeah. The way I would do it, 75% headcount reduction across the board in the federal bureaucracy, send them home packing, shut down agencies that shouldn't exist, rescind every unconstitutional regulation that Congress never passed. In a true self-governing democracy, it should be our elected representatives that make the laws and the rules, not unelected bureaucrats.
Is there a single agency that they can name for which they plan to reduce, quote, 75% headcount?
No, I asked Vivek this yesterday, give me an example of something they'll cut, and he just wouldn't name a specific thing. And that may be because, he's not ready to do that yet, maybe because he doesn't want to make enemies in Washington, on day one. But look, it is possible for them to cut large numbers of federal employees. A lot of people say, well, wait a second, what about civil service protections that the federal employees have so that the federal government doesn't get politicized? That's an anti-corruption effort that goes back generations. Doesn't that protect federal workers? Well, it doesn't necessarily if you do what's called a reduction in force and you chop off huge branches of the federal government and say simply, we're not doing this anymore. We're not firing these individual people. We're ending this entire operation of the federal government. In that case, you can get around civil service protection. So there are ways for them to do this through the executive branch. The problem they've got is that they're not the executive branch. They're this outside commission. They're going to recommend this stuff to Trump. He's either going to do it or not, and then he's going to have to fight with Congress to get it done. And in the first Trump administration, remember, they didn't do a whole lot to cut spending. Mick Mulvaney, the acting chief of staff, admitted to me at the end of his term in the first Trump administration that there just was no political constituency in Washington, despite all the rhetoric for spending cuts. And when parties get in power, they like to spend money because they control where that money goes. That's just an immutable political reality that these guys are up against.
Eamon, can you give me an example just for my own edification? What are some sort of limbs or chunks of the government you could eliminate?
Well, I mean, you could say, geez, take anything. You could look in the Department of Homeland Security and say any piece of the Department of Homeland Security, we just don't want them doing that operation. We don't want them, running this particular organization. I mean, just entire subsections of departments. You could say, we just don't want that anymore. Now, Vivek Ramaswamy told me yesterday he feels that they can do that through executive authority and they don't need Congress, and that they're going to get into a constitutional issue there. And there may be people on Capitol Hill, particularly on the appropriations committees that are in charge of spending the money, who will say, wait a second, you need a law to do that. You got to come to us. You can't just do that through executive authority. So all of this is going to be litigated in the courts. They've set themselves an expiration date of 2026. You know, this might outlast that expiration date, this fight in the courts. It might outlast all of our lifetimes, this fight in the courts.
I mean, Tim, let me show you how the Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, today answered a question about what would happen if, I mean, and Amy gave us a good example. You could take anything. So you could take something out of an intelligence agency and just cut it. Here's her explaining what would happen if you did that inside an intelligence agency, for example.
If we're not connecting the dots, right, if we're not bringing intelligence together, then we may actually miss the next 9/11, right? We're going to have a situation where we're not going to see what the threat picture is, not provide the kind of indication and warning that's needed, not be as successful at countering the national security threats that we face today.
And my only point is, behind every sort of entire function you could cut is some reason why it's there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, look, you listed some of those things at the top. I just think about, like, what are things that Republicans always mention, like the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, right? Like, they could cut all of that, I guess. That might be something that you could do through executive order. There'd be challenges, of course. But again, like, you don't just get to get rid of the woke parts of that, you know, or the whatever, the show that you don't like, that's too liberal, right? Like, if you do that, then that's cutting Sesame Street. That's cutting documentaries that older voters who vote like, you know, the people that turn to the channel to see the news hour that they usually watch. It's not there, you know, like, then there's backlash. Like, any of that stuff that, to Katty's point, there's going to be actual backlash to. So look, I'm on the list of people you mentioned earlier that's like for cutting government waste. You know, if they had a big reconciliation bill, got things together, that said, oh, we can trim some of these departments, I'd be for that. Like, what this is a clown show between two people that don't really know what they're doing, who are smart, who are stirring up a lot of dust. And like, it's just, there's not a ton of evidence that there's going to be any real follow through.
Well, and I mean, the other thing is they're billionaires. And so in terms of having two billionaires go through and decide what government agency is essential to people who aren't billionaires or anywhere remotely close, feels like another thing we shouldn't just glide by as a new norm, Tim.
Yeah, for sure. And it goes to that point about how out of touch can you be? I mean, it's like some of these people whose jobs we're going to take away from them, they're going to do better. I don't know. Who knows? We'll teach them how to code or something. I don't know. We'll give them a job at Tesla. Who knows what their plan is, right? Like, that's just not how life works. Like, once people start losing jobs, people get upset. I mean, big part of Trump's victory was that there were people that were upset about the economy. That, like, he obviously has plenty of people who are on board for the whole MAGA thing, but there's a subset of people that just were upset. They were upset about prices. And if they start, if folks like that start losing jobs and if things get disrupted, they're going to be upset again. And on the billionaire side of this, I saw somebody threw this stat around. If you're a billionaire in America, you've actually had a 1% chance to get appointed by Donald Trump to his cabinet in the first 2 terms already. Like, that's how few billionaires are. Like, it is much more likely, if you're a billionaire, that you've been put in Trump's cabinet than you know, some of other things of that nature. And so I think it just shows, like, kind of how narrow the band of people as he has around him.
I think, Katty, what's interesting about all the billionaires is it's this total mask off, right? I mean, it's not about Joe the plumber anymore. It's not about bringing jobs back or factory jobs back. It is about